Test 1, 2, 3. Test 1, 2, 3. Test 1, 2, 3.
Yeah.
Yeah. Sorry, I just want to make sure I turn on the recording for someone can't get here. But Kathy, it's great to see you.
Good to be back. It is a beautiful day. I was supposed to be on the golf course.
And what happened?
I said, you know what? You sent the email on a trigger.
Oh no, come on. I'm not keeping you from golfing on a beautiful day. There's not that many beautiful days left. Go get your
I know, but the other
Kathy,
day,
go get your golf clubs. Go.
I have a Melton class tonight, so
Oh.
I couldn't get back in time. So the golf would have been rushed, and there's nothing good about a rushed golf game.
The limited knowledge I have of golf, I think I would agree with that completely. Even mini golf is ruined by people standing behind you. At you, you know, it's.
I got a wonderful opportunity. It was staring me in the face, and I said, "I'm taking it."
You know what? You're probably the only person I know who would both appreciate this and be capable of it. But I saw an interesting segment. I forget if it was on ESPN or on CNN, but there is a movement towards something called speed golf, and it's essentially you have a minimal number of clubs, and it's this remarkable young woman, mother of like 3, who realized she loved golf and was like the coach of the golf team, couldn't really play for herself, except she had a window of like 45 minutes every day. And so she literally carries like 3 or 4 golf clubs in a thing. She hits the ball and then she speed runs to the next spot, takes the shot, runs to the next one. By the end of it, you know, it's like I was exhausted just watching it, but I was so impressed that such a thing was possible.
It's like a biathlon with golf and running.
That's basically what it seemed like. It seemed like a biathlon with golf and running. That's
why
is that not an Olympic sport? You know,
by golf-along.
Yeah,
by golf-along.
By golf-along.
What are we up to? I don't really want to tell you where my bookmark is.
No, so actually what we finished up last week would be chapter 9. So the second Isaiah. And actually what we had talked about doing last week was to go back and, again, we're somewhat, Ruth recalls us doing it, so it must have happened, right? That we read.
I have notes in my book, actually, so I know.
Right. So we must have. But basically at the beginning of the class, we read Susanna Heschel, who's Heschel's daughter's introduction, but Heschel himself has an introduction to the book as well. And what happens at this stage of the book is that we sort of transition out of specific prophets into themes. So we thought it might be a good idea to just go backwards a little bit and try to go through the introductory couple of pages just to reframe ourselves so that we know kind of where we're going, because otherwise you could look at each chapter as sort of an exploration in of itself, but it really is part of a larger thesis. So unless there's opposition to that was my plan. Otherwise I've got chapter 10 ready to go to. So.
Oh, that's good. I like
it. Good. That's what I like to hear. Okay, so I'm going to put it up on the screen, even though I think
we all have the book.
We might all have the book. We all have the book.
Yeah, what page would it be?
Well, so the only thing I guess is that I think, Ruth, you have a different edition, right?
I do.
But
yes,
it should be the same introduction. I'd be surprised. So in our case, let's check our Roman numerals for this. I guess it would be 21 in Roman numerals in the preface section, and it'll just say introduction.
Oh yeah. With
an interesting graphic that I've never quite been able to place. So if anybody has any guesses, trying to figure out what that is. But anyway, so we'll do as we normally do. We'll try to have a slightly more accelerated pace, just because I think if we can try to finish this section. Yeah, go ahead.
I'm sorry to interrupt, but I'm sorry, I gave you the wrong information. I thought when you talked about an introduction that you were referring to
Susanna's work?
Heschel's first chapter. So I don't know that we actually did this introduction.
Right.
I'm sorry.
No. So that's actually that. Now I feel better about it, because I was like, I was pretty sure that I could. Anyway, so this is great. We'll fill up a new section with notes. That will be perfect. Okay, so I'll just start reading, and since it's just the 3 of us, jump in anywhere if you have something to say. Otherwise, we'll pause at some logical places to discuss a little bit. Okay. This book is about some of the most disturbing people who have ever lived. The men whose inspiration brought the Bible into being. the men whose image is our refuge in distress, and whose voice and vision sustain our faith. So right off the bat, one thing should strike us as an opening sentence.
Disturbing people.
Right. So we should just understand, right, the word can have multiple meanings, right? These days, when you talk about, for example, if a new technology comes along, you refer to it as disruptive, right? Things like that. So disturbing can also mean to disturb the normalcy, but it also can refer to, in some ways, some fairly disturbing personalities, right? Some of our prophets are not exactly, easy people, to say the very least, but let's see where he ultimately is going. If nothing else, we know right off the bat that his view of the prophets is to hold them in a rather unique space, right? That this is a topic worth discussing. The significance of Israel's prophets lies not only in what they said, but also in what they were. We cannot fully understand what they meant to say to us unless we have some degree of awareness of what happened to them. The moments that passed in their lives are not now available and cannot become the object of scientific analysis. All we have is the consciousness of those moments as preserved in words. My aim, therefore, is to attain an understanding of the prophet through an analysis and description of his consciousness, to relate what came to pass in his life, facing man, being faced by God, as reflected and affirmed in his mind. By consciousness, in other words, I mean here not only the perception of particular moments of inspiration, but also the totality of impressions, thoughts, and feelings which make up the prophet's being. By insisting on the absolutely objective and supernatural nature of prophecy, dogmatic theology has disregarded the prophet's part in the prophetic act. Stressing revelation, it has ignored the response. So I just want to read that one more time. Stressing revelation, it has ignored the response. So how do we understand that? Just very quickly before we go, what is it when he's talking about revelation? What is he referring to?
The miracle kind of thing that the prophets would do, we look at, but not how they actually felt, the response that they felt to us or to God, the actual feelings of the prophet. Is that what he's talking about?
No, very good. So, certainly he's saying that one of the keys to finding any meaning in the stories of the prophets and the books of the prophets is to understand the consciousness of the prophets themselves, right? To understand their identities, the interplay between, as we saw, right? Part of the reason why it seemed worthwhile to go back to this introduction sort of, after the fact, is because now we've read through all of these chapters. We've learned about Jeremiah, we've learned about Isaiah and Hosea and Amos and all of them. And we see that much of his, at least initial thesis, really does bear out, right? That for each of us, I think as we came into this class and what we thought we knew about the prophets as a whole, or even individual prophets, has changed quite dramatically by thinking about their lives as people, first and foremost, right? As what it would feel like to be the person in the place of Isaiah or Amos, etc. But I think this idea of stressing revelation, it has ignored the response, right, is sort of a lot of times, I guess, when we're thinking about the prophets, especially because our main interaction is through the Haftarah, we don't see the full story, right? So we don't always see exactly, right, how does the prophet respond to God's call? How do the people respond to the prophet? How do the friends of the prophet respond, right? All of those pieces are as important as the sort of miracle of revelation itself, right, of the giving of the Torah. So let's finish the paragraph, and then we'll see if he helps us out a little bit further, right? Isolating inspiration, it has lost sight of the human situation. In contrast with what may be called pantheology, psychologists have sought to deduce prophecy entirely from the inner life of the prophets. Reducing it to a subjective personal phenomenon, they have disregarded the prophet's awareness of his confrontation with facts not derived from his own mind. Okay, so this is a sort of complex series of sentences. So I think, how would you parse this out? How would you rephrase this in a less Heschelian poetry? And what would be a more direct way of sort of saying this? Kathy, did you have an idea?
Just a funny thought. I thought he's basically saying there's no psychobabble here. We don't need to dig deep into understanding what's going on. They're really just, he's making it almost like his reaction is objective and clear. It's not like we don't understand what his parents did to him. We don't need to.
No. Warren, Ruth, any additional thoughts? Anything jump out at you?
I find it actually a little confusing.
It's a little cryptic, right?
A
It's
little
certainly-
confusing because first of all, I'm not sure what he means by whom is he talking about here?
right.
When he
That's a lot of
talks-
times that's the first job with studying Heschel is what is the
Yeah.
object of the sentence? You know,
Yeah, by insisting on the absolutely objective and supernatural nature of dogmatic theology. Well, you know, is he talking to us? Is he talking to a group of interpreters? And if so, who are they?
it's an interesting question. One of the things I think that should be pointed out, and I have to actually try to determine what it means, but when you go to the end of this introduction, it says Jewish Theological Seminary, New York City, August 1962. I'm not clear of whether this was a public speech that he gave, right? In other words, that this may have been in fact addressing a group of people, likely his contemporaries to some degree. But I think what he's sort of talking about here, right, by insisting on the absolutely objective and supernatural nature of prophecy, dogmatic theology has disregarded the prophet's part in the prophetic act. What he's basically saying is that our tendency, right, is because we understand prophecy in the way of basically the prophet becoming a loudspeaker, right, a moving, living loudspeaker. And dogmatic theology would intend to suggest that basically that the part of the prophet has no play in how prophecy plays out or how the books of the prophets play out. They are, in a sense, a puppet, right? Or, as I said, a living kind of thing. In other words, that stressing the theology piece of it, stressing the God piece of it, basically takes away the agency or the individual impact of the prophet themselves. So I think what he's trying to basically do is to suggest, again, why this book needs to exist to some degree, is to push back upon, I think, that, you know, Ruth, your question is still germane. Who is it directed towards, right? The four of us, maybe not so, right? I think we like to be a little more open-minded and thoughtful about. But I think what he's referring to is probably generations worth of theologians, first of all, not just within Judaism, but remember, Christianity also has a tremendous amount of scholarship on the prophets as they are part of the Old Testament, right? Thinking in the era of the 60s, in which there was still sort of a I don't know how to describe this, almost a sort of snobbishness around institutionalized theology in the conservative world, right? A sort of an elitism, right? That basically you had certain schools of thought and that there was a correct way of thinking about things, and that the prophets basically are really just, again, God chooses the prophet, tells the prophet what to say, and Zehu, and there's nothing more for us to consider, right? Which is precisely the opposite of what Heschel clearly is trying to do with this book. Ruth, go ahead.
Because I think what I have found in studying, you know, these in our study here, is how unique and individual, it seems to me, each voice is.
Mhm.
And that has been thrilling, because I was, up to now, I knew the prophets through Haftarah, as you suggest, but never having studied, you know, each one individually before, this has come as a kind of revelation to me. Nonetheless, I understand at the same time that it's each individual prophet speaking the voice of God being kind of filtered through, let's say, the individual personality, because these prophets are very different. At least for me, I find that some of them whom I didn't know before, I find I'm really glad to have gotten to know better, because they are very attractive to me, and others whom I wasn't particularly fond of. And I think, judging from what he himself says, I'm not the only one who didn't particularly care for Jeremiah all that much.
Right.
Apparently his contemporaries didn't like him that much either.
Right.
And he complains about it
That's right.
very openly. He acknowledges that he complains about it.
Right.
But and it isn't just that, you know, he's prophesying not such great things for the future, but he seems to have had a very abrasive personality, because nobody wants to hear bad things. But for me, at least, when you get to somebody like Hosea, who is I find very touching,
Right.
you know, in his you know, in his plight, his situation as a kind of lived allegory of his wife
Right.
being unfaithful, and,
Right.
and we have that allegory running through
Right.
all of the prophets of Israel as an unfaithful bride,
Right.
and so on. But somehow I find that the fact that one of the prophets actually lived through that very touching, and the way he expresses himself. So I think that there's a kind of yes, Heschel is probably addressing a specific audience. I don't relate to that audience, but I do find that it is a complicated point here, that it is God's word, it is a kind of revelation. The prophets all in that regard have a common message, but it is told in individual voices, I would say.
Very nice. Very nice. And I should say, because I think Ruth did a great job of kind of summarizing it. You weren't wrong, Kathy. It wasn't the opposite. What you were writing actually is sort of Heschel's counterpoint to the pan theology, as he described, right? The dogmatic theologians. You have the opposite side of the equation, which are the sort of solely psychological understanding of the prophets, is also missing part of the puzzle, right? In other words, that solely seeing it as a internal psychological experience of an individual, who may or may not be experiencing, something otherwise, right, takes God out of the equation, and that imbalances things as well. So it's sort of interesting, again, to say that Heschel is not trying to suggest that by understanding the prophet's individuality that, we are doing one or the other. He's trying to actually see that really there's a balance between the two. In order to understand the prophets, you have to understand the prophet themselves, you have to understand God, you have to understand the context in which the prophet is prophecy. And when you have all of those elements together, then you are able to see it in a richness that you wouldn't otherwise see, which is exactly what you were saying, Ruth. So it's good to hear that that's been the experience, because again, the main reason why this class came into being is because years ago when I first read this, that was sort of my kind of feeling also. Was sort of feeling like, we'd missed so many opportunities to understand these people and these circumstances and these words in such a different kind of way. I just really think increasingly so that we have to start picking some different alternate haftarot, I think, throughout the year, that are less fixated on certain tropes and more, experiencing of other parts of the books and even other of the prophets that don't really get a lot of attention. But I don't know if I have the chutzpah yet to overturn several thousand years of rabbinic practice. I'm not sure I've gotten there yet, but we'll see. Ruth, go ahead.
I also wanted to say I was thinking of this class in our Torah study last Shabbat, when we were talking about the section in Lech Lecha where Abraham is portrayed as a warrior and leads troops against, because that happens later on, before the Israelites, can take over, can settle in the promised land. They have to also go to war, and we've seen God portrayed as a warrior, and we've also seen the Israelites the censuses really of the different. Is it the plural census? Census? I don't know.
I don't know. I never took Latin, so I understand.
Various censuses that are taken throughout the Torah really are about fighting men, who of the people who are of age to fight.
Correct.
So there's this whole, but you're putting this whole the prophets in a historical context by relating it to what's going on between the kingdoms. I think has given, for me, another perspective on the prophets as well, of the time they were living in. They were not living in peaceful times.
Not simple times.
And so I didn't realize that before, and that has given another dimension, I think, to my understanding of the kinds of lives they were living.
So I really appreciate hearing that, Ruth. And I'll say also that perhaps what we will do, should we manage to finish the book in our lifetime, which I imagine we will, that we actually do some work in the ketuvim, in the writings, and some of the narratives that are also sort of historical narratives. Because what's interesting, and you'll notice this if you haven't already noticed, that a lot of times Heschel's citations, right, come from multiple places. in addition to, what you might find here in one place, you see corroboration in other parts and all of those things. So Michael and Rivlin, I don't know if Rivlin is there, and I'm sorry, I just saw the text from Rivlin. That's the only reason I even noticed you were in the waiting room. I apologize. So we actually, what we're doing before we go into chapter 10 is to go back to Heschel's introduction in the book. So we really just started, you didn't miss too much. And the main idea was to just remind ourselves sort of what his main thesis is in writing the book, because the next several chapters really will go into sort of themes more than individual prophets, although we'll talk about individual prophets as well. So we're actually just on the second page of the introduction, which is page 22 in the Roman numerals. So we're in the second paragraph now. So a rejection of both extremes must spring from the realization that the words of the prophets testify to a situation that defies both pantheology and panpsychology. Careful analysis shows that this situation is composed of revelation and response, of receptivity and spontaneity, of event and experience. I maintain, therefore, that the marks of the personal element are to be traced not outside the prophet's act, but within it. Okay, so this is exactly what we were just speaking of. The prophet is a person, not a microphone. He is endowed with a mission, with the power of a word not his own that accounts for his greatness, but also with temperament, concern, character, and individuality. As there was no resisting the impact of divine inspiration, right? There's no saying no. So at times there was no resisting the vortex of his own temperament. The word of God reverberated in the voice of man. It's a powerful phrase, right? The word of God reverberated in the voice of man. So if you were trying to sort of make the elevator pitch for what a prophet is, this would be Heschel's, boiled down the description. The prophet's task, he says, is to convey a divine view. Yet as a person, he is a point of view.
Mm-hmm.
He speaks from the perspective of God as perceived from the perspective of his own situation.
Yeah.
We must seek to understand not only the views he expounded, but also the attitudes he embodied, his own position, feeling, response, not only what he said, but also what he lived, the private, the intimate dimension of the word, the subjective side of the message. In the prophets of Israel, we may trace similarities and parallels to personalities to be encountered elsewhere, since indeed the religion of the Hebrews shared much with other Semitic religions. It is therefore important to compare them with other types of men of ancient history who made similar claims. Yet the more difficult question is, what are the features that set the prophets of Israel apart? What constitutes their uniqueness? So again, let's just try as best as we can to remember these bullet points, right? Because whenever we're reading the rest of the book, this is really what we have to see as Heschel's lens, right? How it is that he is thinking as he's writing this book and what its intention is. The prophet is not only a prophet, he says. He is also a poet, a preacher, a patriot, a statesman, social critic, moralist. There has been a tendency to see the essence and chief significance of prophecy in the display of one or another of these aspects. Yet this is a misapprehension of the intrinsic nature of prophecy. The first objective of our inquiry should not be to see the prophet as an example of a species, but rather to ascertain the characteristics that set him apart, as well as those he shares with others. In order to meet him truly as a prophet, the mind must shed certain habits of inquiry. Traps and decoys of convenient patterns are to be avoided. The most assured way of missing the goal is an approach carried on with the preconceived certainty of being able to explain him. To explain the prophet in terms of a neat set of preconceived notions would be putting the cart before the horse. Explanation, when regarded as the only goal of inquiry, becomes a substitute for understanding. I'm going to read that one more time, because this is one of those lines that's applicable in many different circumstances, right? Explanation, when regarded as the only goal of inquiry, becomes a substitute for understanding. Imperceptibly, it becomes the beginning rather than the end of perception. So, all right, let's just take a second and again, try to translate from Heschel's poetry into regular speak. What does he mean by the idea that explanation, when regarded as the only goal of inquiry, becomes a substitute for understanding? What is he cautioning us against?
there's something besides, there's something other than explanation. What I think he's getting here I think, he says, yeah, you just read that. Imperceptibly it becomes the beginning rather than the end. Maybe there's room for qualities besides, or forms besides explanation as the goals of this. I'm not sure what he's going to say next, but among them, it's possible that inspiration, for example, might be, another end. I'm not sure. But explanation, that's an interesting thing, because I think a lot of what we, well, I want to think about that, because
I think, but this is good.
Are we explaining, or are we doing something else when we study Torah? That's an interesting thing.
So that's why actually there are so many different words for what we use to describe when we study Torah to some degree.
Yeah.
Right.
Why?
Because lidrosh really literally means, right, to explain, right, as it is. And yet at the same time, lidrosh is not the only mechanism by which we engage with Torah. Right. A drash is a very specific thing that is done in a very specific kind of context, but not all study is for the purposes of lidrosh, right? Sometimes it is for other intentions. But your thinking out loud, Ruth, is exactly where we should all really be thinking, right? And trying to understand, what is he really trying to get to? So I don't know if I cut you off. By all means, finish your thought. But if anybody else has anything else to offer, Kathy, jump in.
Yeah, I just thought, what I think he's getting at is you have to think about in the process. If you're more emphasizing the process, you'll have many more conclusions. Just like when you talk about the midrash, you can look at each word translation, it could change the whole meaning. So if you're choosing one, you miss all the others. So I think the key is, don't just go for the goal, but don't miss out on the whole process of evaluating all the different other theories.
Very good. Now, here's the one. Before I give what I, again, surmise to be what he's going for here, the one wrinkle in this, which I'll probably have to call my dad to see if he has any answer to it, and we might have to write to Susanna to find out for sure. As I said, at the end of this introduction, it just says JTS, Jewish Theological Seminary, 1962, in August. Usually when you see something like that, it implies that this actually was a thing that happened in real life. Heschel was known for not holding back, especially when speaking to his colleagues. And one of, I think, his concerns a lot of times was about the sort of I don't know how to describe this. There is a tendency in modern seminaries, and actually probably not just modern seminaries in general, to become overly academic, right? So it's one of the legitimate critiques of HUC, my institution of learning to become a rabbi, is that sometimes it becomes too academic. Right, it becomes too focused on, as what he calls here, the explanation piece, right? That the sole goal of explaining, right, where the prophet lived, how they lived exactly, can we corroborate it? Is there proof of it? What are these texts in comparison mean to each other? Right, that there becomes a sort of myopic way of viewing things when you view it solely through the lens of academia. And so a lot of times, right, his critique of his colleagues of his era, not just the academic rabbis, but the pulpit rabbis, right, was that we were becoming sort of almost disconnected from the experience of the prophet themselves, that we viewed them, right? This actually goes back to, again, one of my all-time favorite teachings from Ruth, of any sort, actually, is about being very cautious not to put Torah like up on the wall like a piece of art. Right, that is a tendency that can happen, that when we look at things, right, maybe less as an art explanation, but more as science, right? There is a period of time in the 1800s in particular, that's what's referred to as Wissenschaft. It's much longer actually in German, but it becomes basically a borrowing from other forms of academic study of sacred text that was going on in the Christian world in particular, right? It becomes an academic study of Jewish liturgy, Torah text. That's how you get things like the documentary hypothesis, right? The idea that the Torah is edited and compiled by various people over periods of time. And Heschel wasn't necessarily against that, but he was often concerned that that sort of way of looking at sacred texts you become almost, what's the word? It becomes almost sterile, right? It's like, imagine a scientist in a laboratory, right, wearing, the full garb so as not to become contaminated by it, right? I think Heschel sort of is saying the opposite, which is to really understand the prophets, you have to put your own sort of heart into the game. You have to start to see the person and the experience and the emotions and all of these things, and not become overly fixated on going into the study with an intention to understand or to define, right? And that if you do so, a lot of times I think what he's saying, right, is that you actually affect your ability to perceive, because you've come in sort of preloaded with an idea. So again, this is all based on a thesis that I haven't proven yet, which is that this was actually a directed comment of his to a particular subset of people. But it wouldn't surprise me if that were the case. If I haven't already said it to you, actually, there is an amazing thing that he once did, like an hour-long, just laid into, and it included him. Heschel was very self-effacing, so he always included himself basically as the person he was directing his comments towards. But he basically laid into a room full of rabbis and essentially told them that their davening had no heart to it, that it was all rote and disassociated from any kind of ruach or spirit. And the reality was, in his era in particular, he was largely right. He was largely right. But it's part of the reason why Heschel, posthumously is sort of loved by everybody. But in his day, he had more than a handful of people who really, couldn't stand him because they felt like he, was telling them what's what. But it was never really, I think, his intention. I think he just really sort of understood that to really study a text such as the Nevi'im, the prophets, you really have to go beyond the sort of simple, right? Either the sort of pan-theological simple, as he talked about, right, the overly dogmatic version, or the overly psychological, academic, sterilized version as well, and to try to find something in between. All right, so if any other comments, otherwise we'll keep moving along. So here he'll explain a little bit more, right? The bias which so many scholars share, and which may be defined as a principle, namely that nothing is to be recognized as a datum unless it can be qualified a priori as capable of explanation, besides being pretentious and questionable, obstructs the view of much of reality and seriously affects our power to gain a pristine insight into what we face. Just as another quick aside, one of the reasons I think, aside from my father, that I always felt so connected to Heschel is that he's the only person who has more serious run-on sentence problems than I do. I mean, this one paragraph is one sentence, but he can do wonders with hyphens for certain. Okay, but again, that's more or less what we were just sort of talking about is what he suggests. So continuing, confining attention to what is given in the literary sources, in other words, the prophetic books, I've sought to gain some insight into the minds of the prophets and to understand the decisive moments of their existence from that perspective. It was not my intention in this study to pass judgment on the truth of their claim to have received revelation, nor to solve the enigma of prophecy by means of psychological or sociological explanations, nor yet to discover the conditions of its possibility or suggest means of its verification. The intention was to illumine the prophet's claim, not to explain their consciousness, but to understand it. By unveiling the decisive features of their awareness, the essential structure of experience as reflected in that consciousness may become manifest. So again, you have to translate Heschel a lot of times into what he's saying, but he's basically telling us why this book needed to exist in his estimation, why it was so important, and why he basically is cautioning us not to do what we oftentimes do, which is to assume that he is writing this with absolute certainty. Okay, remember, we read a lot of times his paragraphs, and because he writes so definitively, and because he writes in such sort of short, poetic fashion, it comes across a lot of times, I think, as an assumption that Heschel is saying this is the way it is and there is no other way to read it. I think what he's trying to sort of prepare us for, which again is part of the reason why it's sort of actually helpful to go back now and to rethink, kind of as we were having our discussions, the individual prophets earlier, is to say that this is really him attempting, with full knowledge that he has no way of verifying the claims, right, to be able to say this is Heschel's understanding of what the prophets are and were and what they were about and what they, ultimately speaking, are meant to convey to us in the era in which we are studying. Okay, So the other piece of it, and not to lose sight of, is, and I think he does an excellent job in the book, but where we have a certain responsibility to go back to the source text, is that he's picking from a bias. He's picking the moments, the experiences, the events, as he calls them, that he sees as the most relevant and resonant to understanding the prophets and the purpose of the prophetic books. So one could read through the prophets, presumably, and look and see that there were other events that may have been more preeminent, right? Heschel chooses what he chooses because he, like any other great thinker or author, comes in with an internal bias, right? He sees in the prophets many resonances with his own life and with the life that he lived and saw in the world that he lived in. And therefore, he comes in with that kind of bias. And there's almost no way to avoid that in this kind of study, but it's important that we remember that and carry that idea with us so that we perhaps we're a little bit less likely to jump on him when he says something that seems authoritative when it is meant to be a personal, sort of reading of a situation. But we have to certainly remember that, we're always going to be getting snapshots from him. We're not going to be getting necessarily the full picture. So going back to study the source text on your own, perhaps between classes, is a worthwhile endeavor to also understand sort of, what is he seeing and what is he choosing to focus on and what events stand out to him that might be in contrast to, for example, some of the other classical rabbis or even us as we're sitting and thinking about this. Okay, so we're now on to the following page. So this will be page 24 in the Roman numerals. What I've aimed at is an understanding of what it means to think, feel, respond, and act as a prophet. Okay, to think, feel, respond, and act as a prophet. It was not part of the task to go beyond his consciousness in order to explore the subconscious or reach out to antecedent conditionings and experiences within the inner life of the individual. A surmise of what lies beyond and below the threshold of the prophet's consciousness can never be a substitute for the understanding of what is displayed in consciousness itself. Nor is it possible to confirm what he affirms. We may arrive at some knowledge of what stirred the prophet as a prophet, of the ideas by which he was moved at particular moments. We cannot prove the realities and events which preceded these moments. Okay? So anyway, we won't go back to the same conversation, but really just to buttress his arguments. The inquiry then was aimed not at psychological motives to be looked for in the prophetic background of the prophet's life, but at motives which are consciously given, even if not explicitly stated, and which constitute or at least reflect the decisive categories or the structural forms of prophetic thinking. So this again can go back to Ruth's earlier comments, right, about Hosea, right, and sort of understanding again what animates his unique prophecy and his actual life and his experiences and all of those things. I think, again, it's not that this is a psychological examination of, but understanding the psychology, the emotional state of the prophet, and why certain themes, for example, emerge in Hosea that don't necessarily emerge in Isaiah or Jeremiah or vice versa, right? The procedure employed in an inquiry for gaining such insight was the method of pure reflection, observation, inspection, tackling, and probing. The sheer seeing of what we face served to introduce us to the realness of the phenomenon and sharpen our ability to formulate questions conducive to the discovery of what is unique about it. Indeed, it requires much effort to learn which questions should not be asked and which claims must not be entertained. What impairs our sights are habits of seeing as well as the mental concomitant of seeing. Our sight is suffused with knowing instead of feeling painfully the lack of knowing what we see. The principle to be kept in mind is to know what we see rather than to see what we know. Okay, so again, you could probably spend an entire, class just on this one paragraph alone. I don't know if this reminds any of you of your, university studies, but there, if you ever took a literature class, right, there were some writers for whom just trying to unpack really what they're saying. But I think he, as he often does, he leaves the end of each paragraph with a nice summary of what he was driving towards, right? He says it in sort of, poetic terms, right? But the principle to be kept in mind is to know what we see rather than to see what we know. So what he's saying is it's the going back to this main argument, right? And I think this is true actually of most scientific or literary studies in general, right, is that the more that you go in with a perception of what it is that you're looking for, the more likely you are to come out with what you intended to find in the first place. Okay, but if you go in with an interest in exploration without a destination in mind, okay, that's really, I think, what he's trying to get at. He's trying to get away from what was the tendency for 100 years of what became, again, a sort of scientific study of sacred text, which was, to have a thesis and to approach it like with the scientific method, right? And to determine things thereof. Another time, perhaps we'll go into a little bit greater depth about what Wissenschaft is and what Heschel is sort of secretly pushing back on in these words. But that is a lot of it, right? And a lot of the sort of discomfort that he had with that. Ruth, go ahead.
Well, I think there have always been schools of thought. I'm thinking about Marxist criticism, for example. Now is feminist criticism,
Right.
Criticism seen through the lens of race. There have always been those, but I think that certainly in Heschel's time, who is the father of Reconstructionism? I'm blanking on his
Mordecai
name.
Kaplan.
Yes, of course. So I took a class many years ago at the Skirball Center. Neil Gilman was I studied with him at for several years, and he gave a course on Heschel and Kaplan, and that was very fascinating. Gilman himself was very much a rationalist,
Right.
and he wound up. So he as a student, he always told a story. He liked to tell a story about going into to greet Rabbi Heschel one morning, and he walked into the room. They said good morning, and Rabbi Heschel said, Dr. Heschel said to him, he's looking out the window, and he calls Gilman over to the window, and he says, "Have you looked at the trees this morning? Do you see the trees?" And Dr. Gilman says, "Yes." Heschel says, do you see the angels in the trees?" Rabbi Gilman said, "Well, no, not really." And Heschel says, "Well, look again." So I mean, he has, and of course, Rabbi Gilman wound up having the same office that Heschel had when he was at JTS, and he was haunted by that. He said
I'm sure.
He constantly had this idea that Heschel was looking over his
the
shoulder,
boogie monster,
saying,
yeah.
"What are you doing?" and criticizing him. They were very different in their thinking.
Very much.
But nonetheless,
Right.
I think that one of the things he's criticizing here when he talks about psychological, sociological, indirectly was Kaplan.
Kaplan. Could very well,
He
absolutely.
was the other giant of that time, and was not of his way of thinking at all.
Very much could very well be the case. And, I learned actually, aside from what I learned about Heschel from my dad when I was in school, so my contemporary Jewish philosophy course was taught by Eugene Borowitz, who, in the Reform world was the preeminent theologian. So to have Borowitz talking about both Heschel and Kaplan, having known and interacted with all of them, right, in their era, was just a fascinating thing, because just like the prophets, their own individual personalities played a significant role in how they saw Judaism, how they saw American Judaism, how they saw Israel, how they related to all of these things. And it's quite remarkable how, again, the effect is sometimes overt, right? Sometimes obvious, but oftentimes is much, much more below the surface. And these little sort of, it reminds me actually similarly of, in his era, Maimonides, and I think it's Ibn Ezra, who really detested each other, and not as people, but as from like a principled standpoint. And so their references to each other are throughout their commentaries on the Torah, and they'll say like, that other guy says this, but that's not how it is, and here's how it really is. Rivlin, go ahead. Oh, sorry, I think you guys are muted.
What I wanted to ask, can you possibly give an example? Take one paragraph, one prophet, and run it across the different people, how each would have what Heschel says this, Kaplan says this, the Borowitz says that. Is there any that
So
I,
the answer, that's a really, because the thing is, you can do that very well for medieval commentators, right? Rashi, Ibn Ezra, Maimonides, right? All of them, because they all wrote Torah commentaries. And so these days you can put them up right next to each other. And it's very convenient. To my knowledge, I don't think that Heschel ever wrote like a standard Torah commentary. In other words, a parsha by parsha commentary, a line by line commentary. Nor do I think that Kaplan did, and certainly Borowitz didn't either. So it would
not
be,
a, not a, not a Torah, I'm
no,
just
no, but
saying.
oh, you
or
mean like on a
can
general?
you- Yeah,
Oh, yes.
to give me an example, so take
So
one
that would be
line
fascinating.
of a prophet, or take one prophecy and
And show their
interpret it
commentary.
as via Heschel, so that I could understand what their
Distinct ways.
differences are.
I think this is a fantastic idea, which I'm going to attempt to do. It may take me a little while, but I'm going to attempt to make that happen. But I can give you in 30 seconds a little bit of a sense. You know, Heschel basically represented his almost his own identity because he himself, again, was the scion of Hasidic families on both sides. He was, you know, at 16 years old, was considered to be like the greatest scholar of his time before the Holocaust. And when he ultimately came to the States, he was brought over by HUC, but he quickly realized that this was not his people, you know, because he's sitting at the table and they're eating shrimp. You know, it's just not going to work so well. So he, in the end, moves from Cincinnati to JTS, where he is ultimately a little bit more comfortable. But in some ways there, he's in a more religiously observant environment where he's more comfortable. But it too is sort of too academic. And yet at the same time, he does not belong at all in the Yeshiva University, modern Orthodox, you know, world either. He sort of existed in his own sort of universe. Kaplan broke off from the conservative movement to create Reconstructionist Judaism, and his tome, his book is called Judaism and Civilization. And his main argument is basically that, you know, Judaism has always been really an evolving civilization at its core. And therefore, his theology and his philosophy was not about a particular way of doing anything, but actually of basically making the argument that in each generation, in each community, Jews were known for innovations, for changes, for adaptations, for minhag, for custom, and also for cultural advancements and things of that nature. And so he sort of took a holistic view of things in that way. And so Reconstructionist Judaism, as a result, never really got a hold because you couldn't make an elevator pitch to America. You couldn't really, still to this day, if you ask a Reconstructionist Jew to explain to you what Reconstructionist Judaism is, all they can tell you is that it is its name, right? That basically it is a reconstruction, a constant reconstructing, right? I think actually they changed their name, if I'm not mistaken. It's not Reconstructionist Judaism anymore. I think it's Reconstructing Judaism. It's as in a constant ongoing process. And then Reform Judaism, obviously, it started in Germany. When I got to the States, it took on something of its own identity, but you know, it represented again like if you took Orthodoxy and you created a still Jewish opposite of it. That's the fastest way I can think to describe it. So Borowitz, though, because he comes along in the 60s and the 70s, he essentially rewrites Reformed theology to some degree. He brings God back into the conversation. He brings revelation back into the conversation. Before that, it became a sort of hyper-rationalist view of things. So if you looked at sort of Heschel, Kaplan, and Borowitz on a line, you would sort of see, and this is a gross generalization, but you would see Borowitz as sort of the most kind of progressive and yet sort of still Torah-based, right, comfortable with theology stuff, right? Heschel being the much more one foot in tradition world and even Hasidic world. And then Kaplan basically, who sort of takes a step off the line altogether and says, you know, I'm not going to put myself in one category or the other because as far as I'm concerned, we've never been one category or the other, and it's a false creation to assume that that's the case. And so every Reconstructionist rabbi and community is going to do whatever it is that they feel is in line with their own internal ethos, et cetera, much more, well, to a degree, right? But even so, like, you know, they're, you know, trying to create a prayer book in the Reconstructionist world is very challenging because there are so many variations on every page. There are probably 4 different ways of doing almost every single prayer, each of which conscious of a different kind of reality. So anyway, all of that's to say, I will get to that, Rivlin, because it would be fun to do and be worthwhile for us to see for sure.
Yeah, I say if we
yeah.
take one poem,
Just one thing,
psalm,
yeah, it's a good way to get a sense of who these guys are and what they're about. So I will do my best to pull that together, but it's a great exercise to be involved in one way or the other. Let me just see if we could read just a little bit more here. And I lost track of where. Okay, I think we're on the bottom of 24 still. Does that sound right to everybody? Last paragraph.
Yep.
Rather than blame things for being obscure, we should blame ourselves for being biased and prisoners of self-induced repetitiveness. One must forget many cliches in order to behold a single image. Insight is the beginning of perceptions to come rather than the extension of perceptions gone by. Conventional seeing, operating as it does with patterns and coherences, is a way of seeing the present in the past tense. Insight is an attempt to think in the present, which is a very large task, I might add. Insight is a breakthrough, requiring much intellectual dismantling and dislocation. It begins with a mental interim, with the cultivation of a feeling for the unfamiliar, unparalleled, incredible. It is being involved with a phenomenon, being intimately engaged to it, courting it, as it were, that after much perplexity and embarrassment, we come upon insight, upon a way of seeing the phenomenon from within. Insight is accompanied by a sense of surprise. What has been closed is suddenly disclosed. It entails genuine perception, seeing anew. He who thinks that we can see the same object twice has never seen. Paradoxically, insight is knowledge at first sight. Again, heavy stuff here to, we'll have to think about this a little bit at home, otherwise we'll probably never move through the entire book. But I'm going to just keep reading. Make sure to make notes for yourselves, because I think a lot of these will be issues we'll come back to as we continue on with the book. Such an inquiry must suspend personal beliefs or even any intent to inquire. Yeah, that's pretty tough. In other words, for example, whether the event happened in fact as it did to their minds. It is my claim that regardless of whether or not the experience was of the real, it is possible to analyze the form and content of that experience. The process and result of such an inquiry represents the essential part of this book as composed a good many years ago. While I still maintain the soundness of the method described above, which in important aspects reflects the method of phenomenology, I have long since become wary of impartiality, which is itself a way of being partial. So that again, right? I have long since become wary of impartiality, which itself is a way of being partial. The prophet's existence is either irrelevant or relevant. If irrelevant, I cannot truly be involved in it. If relevant, then my impartiality is but a pretense. Reflection may succeed in isolating an object. Reflection itself cannot be isolated. Reflection is part of a situation. The situation of a person immersed in the prophet's words is one of being exposed to a ceaseless shattering of indifference, and one needs a skull of stone to remain callous to such blows. Again, the poetry is stunning. I cannot remain indifferent to the question whether a decision I reach may prove fatal to my existence, whether to inhale the next breath in order to survive. Perhaps this is the issue that frightens the prophets. A people may be dying without being aware of it. People may be able to survive, yet refuse to make use of their ability. To comprehend what phenomena are, it is important to suspend judgment and think in detachment. To comprehend what phenomena mean, it is necessary to suspend indifference and be involved. To examine their essence requires a process of reflection. Such reflection, however, sets up a gulf between the phenomena and ourselves, reducing them to dead objects of the mind. It deprives them of the power to affect us, to speak to us, to transcend our attitudes and conceptions. While the structure and the bare content of prophetic consciousness may be made accessible by an attitude of pure reflection, in which the concern for their truth and validity is suspended, the sheer force of what is disclosed in such reflection quietly corrodes the hardness of self-detachment. The magic of the process seems to be stronger than any asceticism of the intellect. Thus, in the course of listening to their words, one cannot long retain the security of a prudent, impartial observer. The prophets do not offer reflections about ideas in general. Their words are onslaughts, scuttling illusions of false security, challenging evasions, calling faith to account, questioning prudence and impartiality. One may be equally afraid to submit to their strange certainties and to resist their tremendous claims because of incredulity or impotence of spirit. Reflection about the prophets gives way to communion with the prophets. I just want to read one more paragraph and then we'll kind of wrap it up for today. Pure reflection may be sufficient for the clarification of what the prophet's consciousness asserts, but not for what his existence involves. For such understanding, it is not enough to have the prophets in mind. We must think as if we were inside their minds. For them to be alive and present to us, we must think not about, but in the prophets, with their concern and their heart. Their existence involves us. Unless their concern strikes us, pains us, exalts us, we do not really sense it. Such involvement requires accord, receptivity, hearing, sheer surrender to their impact. Its intellectual rewards include moments in which the mind peels off, as it were. It's not knowing. Thought is like touch, comprehending by being comprehended.
Mhm.
So, we won't, well, okay, here are our choices. We can talk for 2 minutes, or I can read through the end of, and then we can pick up the conversation next week. What do we think?
Read through the end.
Read through the end. Okay, I'm going to keep going. In probing their consciousness, we are not interested only in the inward life, and emotion and reflection as such. We are interested in restoring the world of the prophets, terrifying in its absurdity and defiance of its maker, tottering at the brink of disaster with the voice of God, imploring man to turn to him. It is not a world devoid of meaning that evokes the prophet's consternation, but a world deaf to meaning. And yet, the consternation is but a prelude. He always begins with a message of doom and concludes with a message of hope and redemption. Does this mean that no human wickedness can prevail over God's almighty love? Does this mean that God's stillness is stronger than the turmoil of human crimes? That God's desire for peace is stronger than man's passion for violence? Prophecy is not simply the application of timeless standards to particular human situations, but rather an interpretation of a particular moment in history, a divine understanding of a human situation. Prophecy then may be described as exegesis of existence from a divine perspective. Okay, so there's a reason why, again, this is italicized. Exegesis is the fancy term for what we would call lidrosh in Hebrew, right? A extrapolation of sacred text, a teaching of sacred text, unearthing of meaning from a sacred text. So what he's saying is exegesis of existence, right? Understanding our own existence from a divine perspective is how he would define the books of the prophets. Understanding prophecy is an understanding of understanding rather than an understanding of knowledge. It is exegesis of exegesis. It involves sharing the perspective from which the original understanding is done. To interpret prophecy from any other perspective, such as sociology or psychology, is like interpreting poetry from the perspective of the economic interests of the poet. Okay, so here he finally gives us at least a sort of concrete example to help us to understand what it is that he, again, is so concerned about. And he really, he's asking a lot. It's asking a lot for us just, to be able to somehow or another be all of these things that he's describing, right? Both a part of and apart from the text, not coming in with any assumptions and yet filled with questions, understanding the words of the prophets in our own, all of these things are really quite hard. But he does point out why it's worth trying to wrestle with it. Because indeed, if you were trying to understand the piece of poetry written by the poet, and your only focus of understanding was to look at their balance sheet, right, it would give you no great insight into understanding either the poet or the poetry. And that there has to be another way of attaching ourselves to the story and to the text. All right, I didn't keep to my own words, though, which was that we're going to finish. All right, does everybody have a couple more minutes in them?
Mhm.
Okay, I'll keep going. If anybody has to drop off, we'll keep recording. The spirit of such exegesis makes it incongruous for our inquiry to take refuge in the personal question, however vital. What do the prophets mean to us? The only sensible way of asking the personal question is to be guided by another, more audacious question. What do the prophets mean to God? All other questions are absurd unless this one question is meaningful. For prophecy is a sham unless it is experienced as a word of God swooping down on man and converting him into a prophet. Proper exegesis is an effort to understand the philosopher in terms and categories of philosophy, the poet in terms and categories of poetry, and the prophet in terms and categories of prophecy. Prophecy is a way of thinking as well as a way of living. It is upon the right understanding of the terms and categories of prophetic thinking that the success of our inquiry depends. To rediscover some of these terms and categories requires careful exploration of the kinds of questions a prophet asks and the sort of premises about God, the world, and man he takes for granted. Indeed, the most important outcome of the inquiry has been for me the discovery of the intellectual relevance of the prophets. What drove me to study the prophets? In the academic environment in which I spent my student years, philosophy had become an isolated, self-subsisting, self-indulgent entity. A dig on, anybody know this phrase? I'm not familiar. Yeah. Encouraging suspicion instead of love of wisdom. And again, this is very much an attack on his early academic experience as much as anything else. The answers offered were unrelated to the problems, indifferent to the travail of a person who became aware of a man's suspended sensitivity in the face of stupendous challenge, indifferent to a situation in which good and evil became irrelevant, in which man became increasingly callous to catastrophe and ready to suspend the principle of truth. I was slowly led to the realization that some of the terms, motivations, and concerns which dominate our thinking may prove destructive of the roots of human responsibility and treasonable to the ultimate ground of human solidarity. The challenge we are all exposed to and the dreadful shame that shatters our capacity for inner peace defy the ways and patterns of our thinking. One is forced to admit that some of the causes and motives of our thinking have led our existence astray. The speculative prosperity is no answer to spiritual bankruptcy. It was the realization that the right coins were not available in the common currency that drove me to study the thought of the prophets. Every mind operates with presuppositions or premises as well as within a particular way of thinking. In the face of the tragic failure of the modern mind, incapable of preventing its own destruction, it became clear to me that the most important philosophical problem of the 20th century was to find a new set of presuppositions or premises, a different way of thinking. I've tried to elucidate some of the presuppositions that lie at the root of prophetic theology, the fundamental attitudes of prophetic religion, and to call attention to how they differ from certain presuppositions and attitudes that prevail in other systems of theology and religion, while stressing the centrality of pathos, a term which takes on major importance in the course of the discussion. I have tried not to lose sight of the ethos and logos in their teaching. Disregarding derivative and subordinate circumstances and focusing attention upon the fundamental motives which give coherence and integral unity to the prophetic personality, I have been led to distinguish in the consciousness of the prophet between what happened to him and what happened in him, between the transcendent and the spontaneous, as well as between content and form. The structure of prophetic consciousness as ascertained in the analysis was disclosed as consisting on the transcendent level of pathos, content of inspiration, and event, form, and on the personal level of sympathy, content of inner experience, and the sense of being overpowered, the form of inner experience. The prophet was an individual who said no to his society, condemning its habits and assumptions, its complacency, waywardness, and syncretism. He was often compelled to proclaim the very opposite of what his heart expected. His fundamental objective was to reconcile man and God. Why do the two need reconciliation? Perhaps it is due to man's false sense of sovereignty, to his abuse of freedom, to his aggressive, sprawling pride, resenting God's involvement in history. Prophecy ceased, the prophets endured, and can only be ignored at the risk of our own despair. It is for us to decide whether freedom is self-assertion or response to a demand, whether the ultimate situation is conflict or concern. So, a lot to unpack. Perhaps as some homework, we can go back and reread a little bit. We'll pick up with just a few minutes of trying to tie the bow back on it, and then we'll go into chapter 10 beginning next week. Sound good?
Good.
Good. Excellent learning as always, everybody. Keep it up.
Thank you.
Get out there if you can today. It's beautiful. Bye, guys.